Hello there. Good early morning to you. Thank you so much for joining me. The official funeral for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II will get underway very shortly. Of course, a truly historic day being marked today around the world. Buckingham Palace releases a new photo of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II that was taken for Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee. Also, Canada's relationship with the monarchy. I'll speak with Canada's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, Ralph Goodale, coming up.
Wherever you go in London these days, there are long lineups to pass in front of Buckingham Palace, to look at the flowers that are all displayed really in piles and piles of flowers in Green Park, which is just down the street from Buckingham Palace.
Also, what should we make of who the United States is sending to the Queen's funeral? How does that compare to who Canada is sending as a part of its official delegation? I'll speak to the former U.S. ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman, coming up. That and so much more is coming up as we look back at the extraordinary life of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Hello there. Thank you so much for joining me. The Prime Minister's office has confirmed that the Prime Minister will, of course, be in attendance. That was well known for a long time. But of course, his wife, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, will also be in attendance. The big part, though, the Prime Minister's office also confirming that after today's official funeral for Her Majesty, the Prime Minister will depart for New York City, where he will take part in a United Nations conference. Of course, one truly historic thing, all governors general and prime ministers from within the past few decades in attendance for the Queen's funeral. A truly historic photo posted by former Prime Minister Stephen Harper to his Twitter account earlier yesterday. And for the latest on Her Majesty's funeral, someone who has been very much involved in the preparations on the Canadian side and just the preparations in general is Canada's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. He's with me now. Ralph Goodale is Canada's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. Commissioner Goodale, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Well, it's a very great pleasure to join you. Thank you for asking me.
I want to start out, obviously, the big event happening today, the official funeral for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, obviously going to be lots of reflections after the funeral is over, I'm sure, as to the extraordinary life of Her Majesty. But going back yesterday and in the days leading up to today, in some cases, people waiting over 20 hours in some cases to see Her Majesty one last time. What does that say about the admiration that people had for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II?
Well, I think it's just huge. Wherever you go in London these days, there are long lineups to pass in front of Buckingham Palace, to look at the flowers that are all displayed really in piles and piles of flowers in Green Park, which is just down the street from Buckingham Palace. And then there's that long queue by the river, which goes across the Thames and way down at one point well over 5 miles in length, where people were sometimes waiting for 7 or 8 hours, sometimes 16 hours or more, 20 hours, to see the casket of Queen Elizabeth in Westminster Hall. The outpouring of affection and emotion and gratitude is huge. People are trying their own unique ways to say goodbye to somebody who really mattered to them in their lives. And we see some of that even in far-flung countries around the world. There are 14 other countries in which Her Majesty was the head of state, and now the head of state is King Charles. Canada is one of those. Australia, New Zealand, many countries in the Caribbean. There's much of the same outpouring of deep respect and gratitude, and of course, mourning and condolences, because that wonderful lady is no longer here.
What do you make of the relationship between Canada and the monarch? Obviously, the delegation that Canada has sent for the official funeral of Her Majesty, former governors general, some former prime ministers. There was a photo published yesterday with a bunch of former governors general and former prime ministers, lots of people talking about the history behind a photo such as that. So what do you make of, again, that relationship between Canada and the monarch, specifically the relationship that Canada had with Her Majesty?
Well, the overall relationship between Canada and the UK is remarkably good, and it's based on hundreds of years of history, and it's rich and strong and vibrant. But the relationship with the monarchy is something extra special. And I think this particular monarch, because for virtually all of us, unless we're 96 years old, she is the only queen or king that we can remember. She has always been there, and there's that sense of strength and longevity and continuity and stability that was there with Queen Elizabeth. She was always a hard worker. She was always wise in the counsel that she would give people. She was gracious and very dignified. But I think of two qualities in particular that make the relationship stand out. One of those is how kind she was. Even when she might disagree with you, or she had a contrary point of view to put forward, it was done in a very gentle and kind way that respected the other person's point of view. And the other characteristic is hopefulness. I think during the pandemic, she was one of the most encouraging voices about how tough it was for people to deal with all of the issues around COVID-19. But if we stick together, if we have each other's backs, if we trust one another and work with one another, we'll get through all of this. And those two things, her kindness and her hopefulness, I think are among the things that made her extra special and contribute to the very emotional feelings that people have now that she's passed away.
And I want to dive a little bit deeper into that piece that you just mentioned, the kindness that she offered to people and the admiration that people had offered towards her. Obviously, lots of people talking about even just little symbolic things, but things that would brighten people up, her annual Christmas message that she would release every year. What do you make of, when you hear people talk about that stuff and how much Her Majesty would brighten people's day?
Well, there was an interview published today in the UK with Camilla, the new Queen consort, who was talking about the Queen's, the late Queen Elizabeth's sparkling blue eyes and that amazing full smile that would just light up the room whenever she had that grin on her face. And you could see it on her appearances on that famous balcony in Buckingham Palace when she would wave to the crowd and break that big smile. It was always real with her. Some people can get a plastic grin on their face and pretend that they like what they're doing or who they're talking to. But with Queen Elizabeth, it was always so authentic and believable. And I think people can tell when it's an act or when people are putting on airs, but it wasn't with Queen Elizabeth. It was real, and she connected with people in a very personal way. Everybody who has had the pleasure of meeting her talks about that. They're in a conversation with her, and she's looking right at you, and you're the only person in the world for those few moments that she's having her conversation. That's a real critical thing to communicate with people, to show that they're being listened to.
And just lastly, before we conclude, obviously, as he was then Prince Charles when he visited Canada just last spring, obviously something that, many Canadians were watching. Now he goes from being Prince Charles to being King Charles III. What do you make of Canada's relationship with King Charles, and how might the relationship between himself and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau here in Canada help us to advance forward on some of those important issues that people care about?
Well, I think we're off to a very good start. People perhaps have not been paying as much attention to Prince Charles, now King Charles, but Prince Charles as he then was, because of course the monarch was the monarch, and the monarch was his mother. Now he has that responsibility, and I think people will gain a much larger impression of King Charles, and a very favorable impression. In this first week, he hasn't been hiding away in the palace. He's obviously grieving. He's mourning for his mother, but he's doing it in a very open, inclusive, public way. He's meeting the crowds. He's going to all the different parts of the United Kingdom. He's been in Scotland. He's been in Northern Ireland. He's been in Wales. He's been at many events throughout London. Last evening, he held a diplomatic reception for 500 world leaders and diplomats from virtually every country on the face of the earth, with only one or two exceptions. He is outgoing, and I think he's going to work very hard at this job of being the king. I think he will travel frequently, and I hope he will travel frequently to Canada. The Queen, former Queen, the late Queen, visited Canada 22 times, but one thing people may not know, in that same span of time, Prince Charles visited Canada 19 times, including the most recent visit last spring. On the issues, I think he is thinking very deeply about an issue like reconciliation with Indigenous people. He understands the significance of the crown in the relationship with Indigenous people. He knows how important that is to the future of Canada and harmonious relationships in Canada. So I think he will be a constructive voice when it comes to reconciliation. He's very proactive on the environment and clean air, clean water, preserving nature, and those issues, which are important to a lot of people around the world, including in Canada. And as you say, he does have a well-established personal relationship with Prime Minister Trudeau, as he does with Indigenous leaders like Perry Bellegarde, for example, the former national chief, and our Governor General, Mary Simon, who is a distinguished Indigenous leader in her own right. So he's got a good foundation to build on. It won't be easy following Queen Elizabeth. She has left some very high standards to emulate. But Prince Charles, now King Charles, has had the best role model he could ever ask for in his mother, and he's had a wonderful teacher. So I think he's prepared, and most importantly, I think he understands the enormity of the task, and he's going to work very hard to meet people's expectations.
Okay, Canada's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, Ralph Goodale. Ralph Goodale, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Obviously, I'm sure very busy times for you, as obviously the official funeral for Her Majesty's about to get underway. But thank you again very much for your time.
Thank you very much for your invitation. I appreciate it.
That's Canada's High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, Ralph Goodale, in London. Now, of course, lots of historic things taking place, not just the unfortunate and very sad passing, obviously, of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, but also King Charles III is the new monarch. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau held his first audience with King Charles III earlier this past weekend that just, of course, passed. Truly a historic thing, of course. Then Prince Charles had visited Canada last spring as he was the prince then. That was seen as historic, but obviously not very many people expecting, no one expecting that just a few months later he would take over for his late mother. Obviously, again, the very sad passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. One interesting aspect, though, of this official state funeral for Her Majesty, Canada sending a whole delegation. Of course, that is because Canada is a part of the Commonwealth, but the US only sending US President Joe Biden. What should we make of who is going for the Canadian side versus just President Joe Biden? Going on the American side, Bruce Heyman is former US ambassador to Canada. Joining me now is the former US ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman. Bruce, thanks so much for making the time. Let's start out the death, obviously, of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, something that is being marked around the world. Obviously, people lining up for hours on end to see Her Majesty lie in state. What was your immediate reaction when you heard of the passing of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II?
Well, clearly it's a sad moment. I mean, reflecting a little bit on what she represented over the course of her lifetime, much of which was as queen. She provided for so many a calming in what ends up being a stormy world, whether there are wars or pandemics or political conflicts. She was a force of calm and decency during this entire period, regardless of the governing aspects of the queen and a monarchy. Her personality, her demeanor, and her ability to bring together and get along with people from all political persuasions, all backgrounds, all socioeconomic levels was refreshing in a world where people, I think, are unfortunately a bit more divided today.
And what are you expecting for the official funeral of Her Majesty? Obviously, expecting hundreds of thousands of people to be on the street, if not more, in London during the official funeral of Her Majesty. What are you expecting?
So we all know that the monarchy, the queen, her family, they do things with such pageantry, with such beauty. And it's just, there's nothing like it really anywhere in the world, the quality in which they execute the pomp and circumstance that they use through all of their official duties and then in these tragic moments. These are the times, though, while it will be attended by many, and while there will be incredible beauty that will be around this solemn moment, it's a point in time of reflection. And that's when we all should take a moment and just pause a minute and think about what she brought to the world. And is there some part of what she taught all of us? Is there some part of that we can bring to our daily lives, to our communications with others, to our business associates, and reflect a bit on the journey she's gone on and honor her? But, like everyone, we're all going to pass at some point, and all of us can teach each other something during our lifetime. And so what are her important teachings that we can all take forward, and so that we can enhance our lives? And I think that's what I expect. I hope that people not only mourn her passing, but reflect upon the gifts that she was able to give us.
And what do you make of some of the gifts that she was able to offer to the world? What do you think people will remember Her Majesty for the most?
Well, I think that, apparently, and I did not have the honor of interacting with her in this way, but apparently she had a keen sense of humor. Her ability to communicate with everyone at every point. She liked to drive her own car. She's known for her, her dogs and her corgis, and she's known for, the process that one goes through in interacting with a queen. And she was formal in many ways, but informal in other ways. I think that people will reflect upon the fact that she interacted with so many world leaders. You have to really think about that. Not only, some 15 prime ministers, some 14 US presidents, multiple prime ministers of Canada and throughout the world. Think about how few people have had that kind of exposure to the leaders of the world in a way that she has. And so I think we should all reflect upon maybe what secrets and wisdom that she kept in her head, but didn't really confer to others. What was she thinking about all of the various people that she met? She never really exposed it. And, while we may have all of our individual opinions, she seemed to be able to conduct herself quite well with people with very different perspectives and views and sets of circumstances.
I want to pick up on that last part just before we conclude. As to, you mentioned you believe Her Majesty interacted with people who she doesn't necessarily have the same perspective on. When you look at how King Charles III will, I guess, work with people, obviously the Prime Minister here in Canada, Justin Trudeau, and him held their first audience together. But how do you, what do you make of how those two leaders in particular will work together for years, perhaps even decades to come?
So I can reflect this way. And I had the opportunity to meet then Prince Charles and Camilla when they visited Canada while I was the US ambassador. And it was an incredible moment. I would say incredible in that the depth in which he conversed with me with regard to my prior career, the intermingling of the business career and the diplomatic career, his knowledge on a number of things that I would have interacted with and that had to do with financial markets, that had to do with the issues of the day. We had an incredibly substantive conversation. He was thoughtful, he was kind, he was generous, but I think that he was pretty darn knowledgeable with regard to the things that were taking place. And I know, you tend to lead a sheltered life of sorts when you're in royalty, especially royalty in the British Crown. But the reality is, I found him to be quite engaging. So knowing the Prime Minister as I've gotten to know him over the years, and the brief interaction I had with then Prince Charles, who's now King Charles III, I think they're going to get along famously. I think they'll get along quite well. And just understand the roles of government and governing will fall on the prime ministers of the United Kingdom and Canada when we're interacting at that level. But the form of government, the king will be really the head of state of Canada, and the Governor General will interact appropriately with the king. And I think it's going to be fine. Not only fine, they're going to get along quite well.
Okay, Bruce Heyman, former U.S. ambassador to Canada. Bruce, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Wyatt, it was great.
Okay, that is former U.S. ambassador to Canada, Bruce Heyman, ambassador. Thank you for your time. And now, just getting right back into things, I do now want to go to Bonnie Brownlee. She is a royal commentator, someone who, of course, knows the royal family well. She knows the behind the scenes of the royal family well. Here's that conversation. Joining me now from London, royal commentator Bonnie Brownlee. Bonnie, thanks so much for making the time. Why don't you just start out with how have um, various world leaders and various everyday people from around the world. What do you make of how they have been responding to the death of Her Majesty? Obviously, we have people in some cases waiting over at one point, I think it was 20 hours to see Her Majesty one last time.
It's actually been quite extraordinary, the amount of people that have come to London, whether they were world leaders or your neighbor. People have traveled from all over the world here to pay tribute to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. The city is crowded. There's lots of flowers in Green Park. There's teddy bears. There's all kinds of things all over the city. And it's been, I think the royal family themselves have performed actually quite well in the last week during the grieving period for Her Majesty. So it's been a tribute to the entire family.
And I know you said when we were chatting earlier that you think the city feels almost too busy because of how many people are there and how many people are there to witness and to see Her Majesty one last time at her funeral that will be coming up shortly here. So again, just what do you make of, I guess not necessarily how people are coming out, but more so how people are, even in some cases, we're expecting some people to be watching from home, obviously. In Canada here around 5 a.m. Lots of people will be watching. 5 a.m. is when the funeral or some of the proceedings will actually get underway. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think there'll be a huge viewing audience. People will be watching this from every corner of the earth. I mean, it's really quite remarkable that a woman, after 70 years on the throne, the impact that she's clearly had in the daily lives of a lot of people in many ways, some, personally, emotionally, their own personal growth, and also for those who actually participate in politics and care about democracy issues and civil society, and that we maintain that. She represents a lot to a lot of people on every level you can possibly think of. And that's the most extraordinary thing about her as a woman and as the sovereign that she has been.
A lot of people are talking about how Canada is, bringing more people as part of the Canadian delegation than other countries such as the US. For example, obviously, a lot of people quick to kind of point out as kind of a counter argument that the reason for that is because Canada is a part of the Commonwealth, while the US obviously is not, in the very famous revolution that happened because of that. What do you make of some of those arguments that are being made?
Well, Canada is very important in the Commonwealth, and it would only be proper and fitting that we have a larger delegation than the United States of America. We're one of the main contributors to the Commonwealth, and we will be very important to King Charles as he moves forward in whatever we do with the Commonwealth. And I hope it is to possibly restructure it or reframe it, or help with relationships with other countries in the realm that would like to leave. So there's a serious role here and a serious role for Canada to play moving forward.
Okay, royal commentator Bonnie Brownlee. Bonnie, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
It was great meeting you.
Thank you. Okay. Here's a look, of course, at some of the historic preparations that are currently underway for the official funeral of Her Majesty the Queen. Of course, one interesting thing, in some cases, people waiting over 20 hours, in some cases, to see Her Majesty lie in state. Of course, that was available to anybody who wanted to see Her Majesty one last time up until yesterday. Obviously, truly historic. Again, people waiting in some cases over 20 hours, I believe, at its peak to see Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II one last time. Here's a look at that. For more on that and for more on some of these preparations that have been underway, the historical aspects of Her Majesty's funeral that is really about to get underway very shortly, Marielle Grant is an associate professor of history at the University of Victoria. Marielle, thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome.
Let's start out, obviously, the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, a very historic day marking the official funeral of Her Majesty. What do you make of how Her Majesty used her reign as the Queen over 70 years to, I guess, bring about good and bring about positivity to people?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, when she became queen 70 years ago, she was living in a world that was quite different from our own, where attitudes and values and assumptions, for example, about colonialism were quite different. And over the course of 70 years, I think she presided over an enormous amount of change. And in particular, in terms of her role as the head of the Commonwealth, arguably one of the important things she tried to do over that 70-year period was to lead the evolution of the Commonwealth into a viable post-colonial institution. Obviously, we wouldn't be talking about the Crown and our relationship with it if it wasn't for the fact that we have a colonial legacy, which, of course, as a country, we're still coming to grips with. And arguably, over the course of her reign, she endeavored to try and help us come to terms, or beginning of coming to terms with that legacy.
And when you look at the way people are marking the death of Her Majesty around the world, how symbolic is that as to how much of an impact she had on people?
Well, I think, it's one of those situations where there are very few people whose death has international reverberations, where that everyone everywhere is talking about what has happened. She was a major figure on the international stage. She was probably the most photographed and most famous woman of the era. And certainly, given that she presided over the Commonwealth, which is an organization involving 54 different nations, she has played a very important role in the history of all sorts of different countries. And I think over the course of her life, I think she visited nearly 140 different countries. So she is an internationally visible figure. And I think the longevity is very important here too, because the majority of people alive have never known anyone else as the Queen.
Okay, that is Marielle Grant, an associate professor of history at the University of Victoria. Another historic thing taking place today, later on today, in the nation's capital here in Canada, where the national commemorative ceremony for the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II will be taking place. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland will be in attendance. That's taking place at Christ Church Cathedral. Again, that is in the nation's capital in Ottawa. Lots of other people will also be in attendance for that. That's just one of the many things being marked on the Canadian side. Of course, many world leaders traveling to London, UK, of course, for the official state funeral of Her Majesty at Westminster Abbey. But of course, many gatherings, many ceremonies will also be taking place once again, including in Ottawa. That is taking place at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And of course, many other events, many other condolences will continue to be offered towards the royal family. And obviously, this truly historic, truly unprecedented time. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, really the only monarch many people have ever known in her 70-plus year reign as the Queen. And obviously many people knowing Her Majesty as, again, the only monarch they have ever known. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is one of many people as a part of, obviously, the Canadian delegation in London for Her Majesty's funeral, but former Prime Ministers Stephen Harper Paul Martin, Jean Chrétien, and Kim Campbell are also in attendance. As I mentioned earlier, the national commemorative ceremony that will be taking place in Ottawa will be attended by Brian Mulroney and Joe Clark, two former prime ministers who are not on the Canadian delegation to the official state funeral, but they will still be marking the sad passing, obviously, of Her Majesty. But again, lots of former prime ministers are in London at Westminster Abbey to mark the passing of Her Majesty for her official state funeral. Also, former governors general is there as well. The current governor general, Her Excellency Mary Simon, is there. But then again, of course, David Johnston, a former governor general, Michel Jean, a former governor general, is also there in attendance as well. There are some Roseanne Archibald, the national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, is there. Lots of people traveling as a part of the Canadian delegation. Joining me once again, Marielle Grant, once again, Associate Professor of History at the University of Victoria. What do you make of how various people and you know, who is a part of the Canadian delegation attending the Queen's funeral today? Obviously, not just former prime ministers and obviously the prime minister, the current prime minister, but also, you know, we have Mark, who's attending, obviously the vice president of the Canadian Olympic Committee. We have Sandra Oh, who's attending, lots of interesting figures who are attending as part of the Canadian delegation to the Queen's funeral.
Well, I think it points to the fact that in organizing this funeral, an attempt is being made to ensure that a wide diversity of people are able to attend, people who represent government, but also people who represent organizations with which the Queen was involved. I think it's very telling, for example, that the cortege on leaving Westminster Abbey is being led by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which one might expect at a state funeral for our head of state. And at the same time, there are members of the National Health Service, the NHS, walking behind. So I think the diversity of the Canadian delegation is part and parcel of an attempt to ensure that there is a wide diversity of people represented in the congregation. I mean, arguably, that's why the Queen wanted her funeral to be held at Westminster Abbey. It's the first state funeral of a monarch at Westminster Abbey since 1760. The general trend amongst the previous monarchs was to have the funeral service at St. George's Chapel at Windsor. And of course, the commitment ceremony later in the day will be there, and there will be 800 people present. But, you know, arguably the Queen chose the Abbey because she wanted to ensure that a wide segment of the population from all her realms could be represented.
And just lastly, before we conclude, what do you make of the way that King Charles III is now interacting? He's obviously held his first audience with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. What do you make of some of the similarities, not just between King Charles III and the Prime Minister here in Canada, but the relationship between him and some of the other world leaders across the world?
Well, you know, it's very interesting that when Her Majesty died and King Charles and Camilla came south to London, I found it very telling that they got out of the car at the gates of Buckingham Palace and did a walkabout, because that is essentially what the Queen herself had done when she had come down from Balmoral after the death of Diana, Princess of Wales. So I think what King Charles has been doing is reflective of the lessons that the royal family learned in the wake of Diana's death, when they were criticized for being too distant and not really acknowledging how the nation felt. So I think from the very outset, he has been making an effort to go out and be amongst the people. And at the same time, he is also establishing the fact that he is now head of state by holding formal meetings with the various prime ministers of the various realms. And I do think it's telling that the first videos and news releases have shown him with prime ministers, leaders of Commonwealth nations. We haven't really been seeing him greeting everyone else in private audiences in the same way. And I think that reflects the fact that at a certain level, he needs to establish the fact that he's now head of state of Canada.
Okay, Marielle, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
You're quite welcome.
Okay, that is Marielle Grant, once again, Associate Professor of History at the University of Victoria. Really appreciate you joining us, Marielle, on obviously, again, this truly historic time in our history. Her Majesty passing away at the age of 96, her official state funeral about to get underway really any minute now. So we are going to leave my live coverage of that here. Ongoing coverage, of course, of Her Majesty's passing. Again, the National Commemorative Ceremony, that will be underway at approximately 12 p.m. Eastern Time. Closer to 1 p.m. Eastern Time, though, is when the actual ceremony itself will get underway. But many things will be happening in the lead up over the course of today to that 1 p.m. National Commemorative Ceremony in the nation's capital, in Ottawa. So going to leave our conversation there for today, this special coverage of that. But of course, the actual funeral for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, that is also about to get underway in a matter of just moments. So stay with me. I'm going to bring you that coverage as well. That is coming up. Stay with us.
Well, I think it's just huge. Wherever you go in London these days, there are long lineups to pass in front of Buckingham Palace. to look at the flowers that are all displayed really in piles and piles of flowers in Green Park, which is just down the street from Buckingham Palace. And then there's that long queue by the river, which goes across the Thames and way down at one point well over 5 miles in length, where people were sometimes waiting for 7 or 8 hours, sometimes 16 hours or more, 20 hours, to see the casket of Queen Elizabeth in Westminster Hall. The outpouring of affection and emotion and gratitude is huge. People are trying their own unique ways to say goodbye to somebody who really mattered to them in their lives. And we see some of that even in far-flung countries around the world. There are 14 other countries in which Her Majesty was the head of state, and now the head of state is King Charles. Canada is one of those. Australia, New Zealand, many countries in the Caribbean. There's much of the same outpouring of deep respect and gratitude, and of course, mourning and condolences, because that wonderful lady is no longer here.
What do you make of the relationship between Canada and the monarch? Obviously, the delegation that Canada has sent for the official funeral of Her Majesty, former governors general, some former prime ministers. There was a photo published yesterday with a bunch of former governors general and former prime ministers, lots of people talking about the history behind a photo such as that. So what do you make of, again, that relationship between Canada and the monarch, specifically the relationship that Canada had with Her Majesty?
Well, the overall relationship between Canada and the UK is remarkably good, and it's based on hundreds of years of history, and it's rich and strong and vibrant. But the relationship with the monarchy is something extra special. And I think this particular monarch, because for virtually all of us, unless we're 96 years old, she is the only queen or king that we can remember. She has always been there, and there's that sense of strength and longevity and continuity and stability that was there with Queen Elizabeth.